Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Come on, let's get this thing livened up a little bit. We are engaged in nothing less than a huge political battle to save democracy, to save the concept of nation states, and to take us away from this new form of government that is emerging in Brussels, Frankfurt and Luxembourg, that frankly, I think, and I'm sure many of you in a country that live behind the Iron Curtain must think, looks more and more, with each passing day, like a recreation of the old, undemocratic and failing Soviet Union. And the battle that we fight is a battle to make sure that our children and grandchildren can grow up and live in a free democracy as free people. It's just as important as that. It's funny really that I'm here in Prague, and thank you very much everybody for inviting me, but it's all rather odd really, because I'm not really a politician at all. Now, my advice to those of you who ever want to do any public speaking is never begin with an apology, but no, I must apologise, because if anybody came along here today expecting to see a career professional politician, they're in for a very profound disappointment. No, I was educated at one of England's most expensive public schools, and left having failed virtually everything at the age of 18, did not proceed to university, and went straight to work in the City of London. And I was involved in the commodities business on an institution called the London Metal Exchange, where we bought and sold copper, aluminium, lead, zinc, nickel, tin, and were the hub in fact of a truly global market. So I actually now consider I have a big advantage over most career politicians, because generally, if you look at Western countries, we're now run by a bunch of college kids who've never actually had a job in the real world. They haven't served in the army, they haven't run a business, they haven't risen through the ranks of a trade union or through a charity. Most of them go straight from university into becoming research officers, and then they become members of parliament, ministers, sometimes even prime ministers, and if it all goes completely wrong, they finish up, of course, as European commissioners. But perhaps a bit more of that later. So, no, I feel I have a slight advantage, because I always say to people that I worked in that City of London, and for 20 years I worked damned hard up until lunchtime every single day. And for those that know the booze culture of Britain in the 80s, you've probably seen the Brits on stag weekends here, so you might understand what I mean. I was never going to be involved in politics, but I was a supporter of Margaret Thatcher, who I thought was an incredibly brave woman. You know, she recognised something, that when she came to power, top rate tax in Britain on earned income was 83%. Top rate tax in Britain on unearned income was an incredible 98%. And of course what was happening in Britain, well, in the 70s, was our very brightest and best would leave our top universities, and before becoming doctors, before becoming surgeons, before becoming lawyers or accountants, the first thing they did was to catch an aeroplane somewhere else. And we finished up losing the cream of a generation, and they went to Australia, they went to America, they went across the world. And what Thatcher did, by making taxes reasonable, is she gave people an incentive to work hard, an incentive to stay in the country, an incentive to reinvest in the country. And she got rid of a whole mass of statist, protectionist legislation. And by the end of her 11 years, and certainly where I worked, in the City of London, suddenly we saw money flowing into Britain from across the world as global companies wanted to invest in our country. So economically, if you worked in a coal field, if you worked in a state-subsidised car company, it might have been a tough few years. But overall, for Great Britain PLC, we saw the most unprecedented rise in personal income and personal wealth. So I was busy working in the city, earning lots of money, of course being young, spending even more, but never mind. And, you know, I would play golf at weekends and go to the pub in my village on a Sunday lunchtime, and was bringing up a young family. And, you know, there was nothing, but I'd never even stood for local council. But when I heard the news in October 1990 that the Conservative government had taken Britain into the exchange rate mechanism, the method by which we pegged sterling effectively against the Deutschmark, I won't share with this audience what my initial words were, but suffice to say they were not particularly complimentary. Because one of the things that I'd seen in my career in the city was that whenever governments think they can fix the price, they can fix the price of a commodity, they can fix the price of a currency, what economic history had taught me was that governments in those situations have a 100% track record of always being wrong. Because you have imbalances in markets. You know, and you have markets that go up and markets that go down, and set government pricing doesn't work. So this was my initial wake-up call. And the next day, I caught the train up to London, and I read my newspaper, and I realised that not only had the Conservatives signed us up to this big step towards us joining the euro, but that they'd done so with the full-hearted consent of the so-called opposition parties in Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And it was the first time in my life that I recognised the emergence of this new political class. A class who on all the big issues fundamentally agree. I often say in Britain that you can't put a cigarette paper between Miliband and Cameron on most major issues of substance. So I started to get angry. And then I saw a treaty that was signed at Maastricht. And I took the time and trouble to read it, which I discovered later was more than most of our members of Parliament had done. They just did what the party whip told them to do. And I read this treaty, and it seemed to me that if this treaty was passed, effectively, nearly all of our laws would be made somewhere else. That we wouldn't actually be governing our own country, and that we would hand over power, not just overseas, but to an institution, namely the European Commission, who I was to clash with later, but we'd be handing over power to a European Commission who we cannot elect and we cannot dismiss, and which therefore goes completely against any principle of democratic accountability. So I was so angry after Maastricht that I decided I must do something about it. And I found this very small group of about a dozen intellectuals that I met in London, and we set up this new party. And within a few weeks of this party being formed, there was a by-election for a British parliamentary constituency. So I stood, and I was UKIP's first ever candidate. I'd never fought an election. Nobody in the party had ever fought an election. We hadn't got a clue what we were doing. And when the night of the results came out, I discovered that by a stunning, massive 48 votes, I had managed to beat the leader of Britain's official monster raving loony party, and therefore I'd not quite come last. So to say that politically UKIP started from very small beginnings, I think would be entirely accurate. Anyway, I battled my way through. I fought a whole series of elections. I never wavered from my view that Europe, or the European Union rather, was headed in the right direction. And then in 1999, I found myself elected to the European Parliament, which some people think odd, as I don't really think British MEPs should be in the European Parliament. But I've tried to use that platform of going to Brussels, of seeing what goes on. I've tried to use that platform back in the United Kingdom to wake people up and to educate people as to what has been done in their name. And my first term there was a relatively low-key affair. But in 2004, I found myself group leader, joint leader of a group in the European Parliament, and indeed Vladimir Zelensky, who's in the room, in fact used to sit, I think, the next row behind me, in that Parliament. And I found myself for the first time actually on the big stage, politically. And this was the day when a new commission was being presented to the European Parliament. And it was amazing. Everybody said that it was absolutely wonderful that we had this new European Commission. They were all absolutely top-class people, and the Parliament should have no hesitation in approving of this deal. And we went round the room, and the group leader of the EPP, and the group leader of the Socialists, and the group leader of the Greens, one Daniel Cohn-Bendit, of course well known for the 1968 Paris riots, but how clever some of these people are at reinventing themselves. And they went round the room with everybody saying what a marvellous thing it was that we had this new European Commission, and that it meant that Europe was on the road to reform. Anyway, they got round to me, and this was my first big go, and I said, I thought the Parliament ought to know that before we approve this Commissioner, that there are one or two little difficulties. Was the Parliament aware that the French Commissioner had just 4 years ago been convicted of embezzlement, given a 2-year suspended prison sentence, and barred from public office for life? Which I thought was quite a good start to a speech, really, in those circumstances. And it was as if, you know, a bomb had gone off. Suddenly people were screaming and shouting, and there was this funny little Frenchman who sits about, I don't know, 10 yards or meters, 10 meters to the left of me, and he sort of jumped up and started waving his arms to the President, saying that, you know, the hearing should be stopped, and I went on. And I went on through this full list of people who, of course, in communist times, people like Kadar, you know, had worked hand in glove with the Soviet regime. I talked about the British Commissioner, Peter Mandelson, who twice had been sacked from the British Cabinet, once for a mortgage fraud, for which the rest of us would have gone to prison, but as I pointed out, he was actually one of the better ones. And I went through this speech, and the funny thing was, this little Frenchman to the left of me, who was, by this time, he was getting really agitated. He'd gone absolutely crimson, and he was running up and down the corridors like a man stuck in a burning building looking for the exit. I mean, I thought the chap would keel over at any moment. You know, he really was in a bad way. Anyway, I sat down, and this was the first time they decided to turn their guns on me, something I was to get used to as the years developed. And I was told that I was a disgrace, that I brought shame on the European Parliament, that I had to apologise, and that everything I said was lies, and that if I didn't withdraw, then I would have to face the full legal consequences for what I'd done. Which is funny, really, because I thought the whole point about Parliament's folks was that you were able to stand up and, within reason, say what you thought. Well, the story was that indeed I was right, that the Frenchman had been convicted of embezzlement. But in France, they got rid of a monarchy, but they replaced it with a president who has far more powers than Louis XIV ever had. And what Chirac had done is he'd given this guy a very special kind of French amnesty. And what it means in France is not only is the individual forgiven, but it didn't ever happen. Oh yes, but it gets better. And not only did it not happen, but it then becomes a criminal offence to say that it did happen. And that I'd uttered these words on French soil. So the question was, Would there be some awful police van waiting for me outside the door, or would I be the modern-day Papillon and sent off to some terrible prison island for what I'd done? In fact, in the end, it was adjudged that even though we were in France, that the European Parliament soil itself was extraterritorial. And of course, the funny little Frenchman who got so agitated and was running up and down the corridors, well, it turned out, I didn't know who he was, but it turned out he was a former French culture minister who'd been convicted in the same scandal. So that taught me quite a lot about the Parliament. And we fought on. And of course, in those days, we had something called the European Constitution, with Giscard at the helm, and quite unashamedly, they decided that they would turn the Union into a full legal state. And we in our group did what we could to fight that. Now, very few countries had the opportunity of having a referendum on this. Very, very few indeed. But the French, of course, did have a referendum on the Constitution, and the French said no. And I remember just 4 nights later, the Dutch had a referendum on the Constitution too. And we were all in session at the European Parliament, and about 100 of us were in the press bar at 9 o'clock, waiting for the results to come out from the Netherlands, and up the results came, and 2/3 of the Dutch had said no to the Constitution. And I thought, that's it. We've beaten them. The French have killed this thing, the Dutch have buried it, we've struck a real blow here for democracy, we've changed the future of the European Union. I really did think, at that moment, we'd achieved something very significant indeed. More fool me. For at that moment, as we stood there, with champagne opening and people generally celebrating, at that moment I saw a German MEP called Joe Leinen, socialist German MEP, and somebody who'd been a co-author of the constitutional document itself, working directly for Giscard. And I saw Leinen walking down the corridor, obviously off to do an interview. And so what I did is I made my way across to him as modestly as I possibly could in the circumstances, which I suspect wasn't all that great really. And I asked him whether he'd like to join us in a glass of champagne to celebrate the fact that the will of the people had been heard. And he looked at me. He said, "Nigel, you have your little celebration tonight. We have 50 different ways to win." And one of those funny moments in life, when you go from elation to just everything draining out of me. And it was the first time I realised that what we were up against here were bad people. And by that I mean, not people with whom I have a differing opinion. You can disagree with people on all sorts of things in life and actually have a civilised, friendly conversation with them. You can respect the fact that another person has a different view to you. Well, within a couple of weeks of Leinen saying that to me, the Constitution was dropped, and it was rebranded, if you remember, as the Lisbon Treaty. And we had a guy called D'Amato, a former Italian Prime Minister, who publicly said that the good thing about calling it a treaty and not a constitution is we won't need to put it to referendums. That is what these people did to get these laws through. And that is the moment at which I think the European Union changed. And if I'd been Eurosceptic up until that point in 2005, well, since 2005, I have been an outright opponent of the whole thing. I think it is bad, I think it is evil, I think it is wrong, I think it is not undemocratic. Don't let people con you that there's a democratic deficit in the European Union, and all we need to do is to tweak it at the edges, and somehow it'll all be better. The European Union is not undemocratic, the European Union is anti-democratic. It does not believe.